The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Every person present, from the judge to the audience, sat on the edge of their seats. Eyes were fixed on the young girl standing alone at the witness stand. Lucy Carter, a 15-year-old girl with dark eyes that flickered nervously between the judge, her mother, and the people watching. Her body trembled slightly, her hands clenched in front of her, but her gaze never wavered. It had taken everything inside her to get here, to expose the truth. But she couldn't stay silent anymore. Lucy had always been a quiet girl, the kind who preferred to blend into the background rather than stand in the spotlight. She wasn't used to attention, and she certainly didn't like it. But today was different. Today, her family's secret had become too heavy to carry on her own. Today, she would reveal everything. The truth had to come out. Her eyes quickly darted to her mother, seated in the audience. Diane Carter's face was pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, avoiding Lucy's gaze. The woman who had always been Lucy's rock now looked like a stranger. Lucy's heart squeezed with guilt. But guilt wasn't enough to stop her anymore. Not when the truth was so much more important. "I know what happened." Lucy's voice was shaky at first, but it grew steadier with each word. "I know what you've been hiding. You knew what happened, and you kept it from me. You kept it from everyone." The words hung in the air, and the tension in the courtroom became unbearable. It was as if time had frozen. Her mother's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing but unable to form words. Several people in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the girl's boldness. Lucy felt her pulse race, but she couldn't look away from her mother. The truth had been buried for so long, and it had to come out, no matter what it cost. No more hiding, no more pretending. The whole room had to know. "You kept it from me," Lucy continued, her voice growing louder now. "You kept it from everyone, all these years, and I can't pretend it didn't happen anymore. You're not the only one who's been hiding something, Mom." The room was still. Her words felt like they had hit everyone like a wave, knocking the air out of them. Her mother's lips trembled, tears welling up in her eyes, but no sound escaped her. Diane looked stricken, lost in shock. The realization that her daughter had just revealed something so deep, so painful, had paralyzed her. Lucy's heart ached as she took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was it. There was no going back. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the judge, the jury members, all of them watching her. Everyone was waiting for her to explain, but Lucy had said what needed to be said. There was no more explanation necessary. "I'm sorry, Mom," Lucy whispered, her voice softer now, but filled with a strange sense of finality. "But I can't live with this anymore. I can't stay silent." She looked at her mother one last time, her gaze filled with sadness. But she couldn't take it back. It was time to face the consequences. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on the entire room. Lucy stood there, waiting for a reaction, but no one spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. It felt like the entire courtroom had collectively held its breath, frozen in place. And then, in the next instant, her mother collapsed. The shock of the revelation was too much. Diane slumped forward, her body going limp in the seat as she fainted. Lucy's heart skipped a beat as she watched the guards rush to her mother's side, but she barely registered their movements. She didn't take her eyes off her mother, who was now being helped by two guards as the courtroom shifted into chaos. The moment felt surreal. "Mom!" Lucy cried, but no one seemed to hear her. The guards were already attending to her mother, but Lucy's mind was still reeling from what had just happened. The truth was out, but her world was falling apart around her. She could hardly breathe, as if the weight of her actions had suddenly become unbearable. The judge, trying to regain control of the situation, cleared his throat. "We will take a short recess," he said, his voice firm, but not without a hint of concern. "Please remain calm. Everyone, please remain in your seats." Lucy was escorted out of the room, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts she couldn't process. Her heart was racing, but there was no time to think. She had done what she came here to do, but now what? What would happen next? Would anyone believe her? Could her family survive this? She collapsed into a chair outside the courtroom, her body trembling as she struggled to catch her breath. She had done it. She had exposed the truth. But now she had to face the consequences. Her mother had fainted. Her life had just changed forever, and she wasn't sure if there was any going back. Lucy sat there in silence, the minutes ticking by slowly. Her mind raced, but she couldn't seem to focus. What would happen now? Would anyone believe her? Would they understand? And most of all, would her mother ever be the same again? For the first time in a long while, Lucy felt the weight of uncertainty crush down on her. She had taken the first step into the unknown. But now, there was no telling what came next. Lucy sat in the sterile hallway, her hands clenched tightly on her lap. She could still hear the echoes of her own words in her mind, the truth spilling out in front of the judge, the jury, and everyone else in that courtroom. The silence that had followed her revelation was deafening. She had never felt more exposed, yet a strange sense of relief washed over her. But that relief quickly faded as the weight of the moment began to sink in. Her mother had collapsed in front of everyone. Lucy's heart had stopped when she saw her mother's lifeless body slump in the chair. The woman who had always been her rock, her protector, was now a victim of her own lies. Lucy had never imagined that things would unfold like this. She had expected the truth to be hard, but not like this. Not with her mother breaking down in the courtroom. A sharp noise from the door pulled Lucy from her thoughts. She looked up to see her father entering the hallway, his face drawn and tired. His usual composure seemed fractured, the lines of worry etched deeply on his face. He approached her slowly, his eyes searching her face as if looking for signs of what she might need. "Lucy," he said, his voice low. "Are you okay?" Lucy wanted to say no, to tell him that nothing was okay, but she simply nodded. She couldn't find the words. The truth was out, but everything still felt upside down. Her entire world had shifted in those few moments. Her mother's secret was no longer buried, but its consequences had only begun to unfold. I did it," Lucy said, her voice shaking. "I told them the truth. But I don't know what happens next." Her father knelt down beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He gave her a small, reassuring squeeze, but Lucy could see the doubt in his eyes. The same doubt that was eating at her. "You were brave," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you. You did what you had to do." Lucy forced a smile, but it felt hollow. She didn't feel brave. She felt scared, overwhelmed, and utterly uncertain. Her mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. Was this really the right thing? Would her mother ever forgive her? Would she even survive the fallout? Before she could answer, the door to the courtroom opened again, and the judge stepped out into the hallway. His face was serious, and Lucy could sense the gravity in his expression. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, turning his attention to her father, "we need to speak with you and your daughter." Lucy's father glanced at her, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and something else. something she couldn't place. Without a word, he nodded to the judge and motioned for Lucy to follow him. Lucy's heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had no idea what to expect now. Was the truth truly over? Or was this just the beginning? As they entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The judge's presence seemed to fill the space, his authoritative figure casting a shadow over everyone in the room. Jury members and other officials sat in their seats, eyes trained on Lucy and her father. The weight of their attention made Lucy feel small. This wasn't just about family anymore. It was about something much bigger. The judge motioned for them to sit. Lucy, trying to steady her breathing, sat beside her father. She could feel his tension, the way his body was stiff and rigid, like he was bracing for something terrible. "Your testimony today has shifted the course of this case," the judge began, his voice steady and full of authority. "There are many questions now, questions that need to be answered." Lucy's stomach turned at the judge's words. She had known that her actions would lead to consequences, but hearing it out loud, seeing it spelled out so plainly, made everything feel so real, so heavy. She had opened a door, and now she was facing whatever would come through it. "Your mother is involved in serious criminal activity," the judge continued, his gaze flickering briefly to Lucy's father. "We don't know the full extent of her involvement yet, but it's clear that your family has been hiding more than just a simple misunderstanding." Lucy felt her breath catch in her throat. Her mother? A criminal? The woman who had raised her, who had always been so caring and protective? How could this be true? The truth that Lucy had uncovered in that courtroom seemed impossible. She wanted to deny it, to scream that it couldn't be true. But deep down, she knew it was. She had been right all along. Something was terribly wrong. Her father's grip tightened on her hand, and Lucy could feel his fear. He had always been strong, the pillar that kept their family standing. But now, his worry was evident. His gaze was distant, his posture rigid. It was clear that he, too, was processing everything. This wasn't just about protecting his family anymore. It was about facing the reality of the situation. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've revealed?" the judge asked, his voice serious as he looked directly at Lucy. Lucy nodded, her throat tight. The reality of her situation was beginning to settle in. This was no longer about secrets between mother and daughter. This was about criminal activity that could tear their entire family apart. "We will need time to assess the situation," the judge continued, "but the fact remains that your mother's involvement in these activities has exposed your family to danger. This isn't just a legal matter anymore. There are far-reaching consequences." Lucy could feel her father's hand tighten around hers. She wanted to ask him what was going to happen to her mother, to them. But the words wouldn't come. The uncertainty of the situation was suffocating. She had uncovered the truth, but now the reality of what that truth meant was dawning on her. Nothing would ever be the same again. "I suggest you and your family prepare yourselves," the judge said, his voice softer now. "The truth has a way of coming to the surface, and now that it's out, there's no turning back." Lucy's mind spun as the judge stood, signaling the end of the session. The weight of the words he had spoken felt like a burden pressing down on her chest. Everything had changed. But was it for the better? As the door to the courtroom closed behind them, Lucy felt a coldness seep into her bones. Her life, the one she had known, was no longer her own. Everything she thought she knew was falling apart. The truth had set her free. But at what cost? Lucy walked slowly down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls seemed to close in on her, and her mind raced with the events of the day. The words she had spoken in court, those harsh, unforgiving truths, kept playing over and over in her head. Her mother's face, pale and shocked, was burned into her memory. Lucy had wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all she could do was watch as her mother fainted in front of the entire courtroom. The truth had come out, but what did it all mean now? Her father had been silent since they left the courtroom, his eyes locked ahead, his expression tight with frustration. Lucy could feel the tension in his every step. He had always been the rock of their family, the one who held things together when it felt like everything was falling apart. But now, Lucy wasn't sure if even he knew how to handle the weight of what had just happened. They reached the exit of the courthouse, and Lucy's father paused, looking back at her. His face softened for a moment, but then the mask of worry returned. "We're going home," he said, his voice low. "We'll talk there." Lucy nodded, but she didn't feel the comfort she had hoped for. She had done what she felt she had to do, but now that the truth was out in the open, she was unsure of what to do with it. The lie they had been living for years was finally exposed. But was it the right choice? Was there any going back? As they walked to the car, Lucy's thoughts turned back to the day before, when she overheard her parents' argument. It had been the tipping point. She had always suspected that something wasn't right in her family, but when she overheard them talking about telling her and not hiding it anymore, Lucy's heart had skipped a beat. She had spent the entire night thinking about what those words could mean. The idea that they were keeping something so important from her was unbearable. But what was it? What was this big secret they were trying to protect her from? Lucy had waited for an opening, for a chance to confront them, but the moment never came. The next morning, she found herself standing outside the courtroom doors, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Her decision to confront her mother in front of everyone was sudden. Yes, but it had been building inside her for months. The secrets had piled up, and she couldn't take it anymore. When Lucy stepped into the courtroom that morning, she had no idea how it would unfold. The weight of what she was about to do had felt suffocating, but she didn't have a choice. She had to speak the truth, even if it meant losing everything she had known. Her mother's collapse had been an unexpected turn, and now, as Lucy sat in the car beside her father, she couldn't help but wonder, was she being too hard on her mother? Had she made the right decision by exposing it all? "Dad," Lucy said quietly, breaking the silence between them, "do you think I did the right thing?" Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't place. Sadness? Regret? "Lucy," he said slowly, his voice tight, "sometimes the truth is the hardest thing to face. But you did what you thought was right." Lucy nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. Her father wasn't saying what she needed to hear. He wasn't telling her that it would all be okay. Maybe that was because he didn't believe that. Maybe he didn't know what would happen next either. As they drove home, Lucy's mind returned to the conversation she had overheard between her parents the night before. Her father had said, "I can't keep hiding it from her." And her mother had responded, "She's too young to understand. She'll never get it." That had been the moment. That had been the breaking point. Lucy had always known that something wasn't right, but hearing her parents' words only confirmed her worst fears. What was it that they had kept from her all these years? The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. What if she wasn't ready for the truth? What if learning it would change everything? The night before, her mother's voice had trembled as she whispered, "She'll never understand." It's too big for her to handle. But Lucy had understood enough. She had overheard enough to know that this wasn't just an argument about money or a small family secret. It was something much more dangerous. As the car pulled into the driveway, Lucy took a deep breath. They had arrived. But as they walked inside the house, Lucy's thoughts were still miles away. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Lucy whispered to herself. She wasn't sure if she was asking her mother or if she was asking the universe. What was so important that you had to keep it hidden? Inside, the house felt different. It was familiar, but there was a heaviness in the air now, like the walls themselves knew something had changed. Lucy walked into the kitchen, but the space felt cold. Everything seemed quieter, as if the house was holding its breath. Her father sat at the table, his fingers drumming lightly on the surface. Lucy could feel the weight of the silence between them. Her mind raced as she replayed the events of the day, trying to process everything that had just happened. The courtroom, the truth, her mother's collapse. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Lucy finally asked, her voice tentative. Her father didn't answer right away. He just stared at the table, his eyes distant. After a long pause, he spoke softly. "I don't know, Lucy. I don't know." The uncertainty in his voice made Lucy's heart ache. The family she had known, her mother, her father, was slipping through her fingers. Nothing was what it seemed, and there was no going back. Lucy sat down beside him, her thoughts consumed by what had happened and what was still to come. Everything was changing, but the future felt uncertain and terrifying. She had exposed the truth, but what would it cost her? And could she still save her family in the process? The weight of the truth hung over Lucy like a dark cloud. She lay awake in her room that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The silence in the house felt suffocating, and the memory of her mother's collapse in the courtroom played in an endless loop. Lucy had exposed the family secret, but she wasn't prepared for what had followed. She had thought revealing the truth would bring clarity, but it had only brought more questions, more confusion. What would happen to her mother? Would she be arrested? Would the truth destroy everything Lucy had ever known? Lucy closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back. Her mind raced with images of her mother's pale, tear-streaked face, and the sound of her voice trembling as she fainted. She couldn't stop thinking about the way her mother had looked at her, as though the world she knew had crumbled in a single instant. What had her mother done? What was it that had been hidden for so long? The truth was out now, but that didn't make it any easier to process. The whole situation felt surreal. Lucy had never imagined she'd be the one to expose the family's darkest secret. She had always been the quiet one, the observer, the one who stayed in the background. But today, she had taken the step into the unknown. She had broken the silence, and now there was no going back. Lucy sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes. It was late, far later than she should have been awake, but sleep was nowhere near her. She could still feel the anxiety tightening in her chest, the weight of everything she had done. Her father had been there for her, trying to reassure her that she had done the right thing. But Lucy wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. What if her mother never forgave her? What if she had made everything worse? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Lucy!" her father's voice called from the hallway. "Can I come in?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yeah, Dad. Come in." The door creaked open, and her father stepped into the room, looking more tired than ever. He had removed his jacket, and his tie was loosened around his neck. He didn't look like the same man who had always been in control, the one who seemed to know how to handle anything. Now, his face was drawn with exhaustion, and his eyes held a weight that Lucy hadn't seen before. "How are you doing?" he asked softly as he sat down on the edge of her bed. Lucy swallowed, trying to find the right words. She didn't want to admit that she felt lost, that she didn't know what was coming next, but she couldn't lie. "I don't know, Dad. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." Her father sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know it's hard. I never wanted you to have to deal with any of this, Lucy. You're too young to carry this kind of weight. But you did what you thought was right. And I'm proud of you for that." "I don't feel proud," Lucy muttered, her eyes on the floor. "I just feel scared. What happens now? What happens to Mom?" Her father's expression softened, and he reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I don't know yet. We'll figure it out. We have to trust the process, and we'll get through it. Your mom is going to need time, and we'll be there for her." Lucy nodded, but the doubt still lingered in her mind. Could they really get through this? Was everything they had built as a family really going to survive the truth? Her mother had always been the one who kept everything together. Now, Lucy wasn't sure who her mother really was anymore. How could she have kept something like this hidden for so long? A long silence settled between them. Lucy didn't know what to say. Her father had always been the one to offer the answers, to calm her down when things got tough. But now, he was just as lost as she was. "Dad?" Lucy spoke again, her voice uncertain. "Do you think we'll be okay?" Her father's gaze softened, and he looked at her with a mixture of affection and concern. "We're going to be okay, Lucy. We have to be. But we need to stick together. We'll get through this, even if it feels like the world is falling apart right now." Lucy nodded, trying to believe his words, but doubt crept in. She wanted to believe that things would go back to normal, that their family could survive this. But deep down, she wasn't sure if anything would ever be the same again. The next few days felt like a blur. Lucy barely saw her mother, who had been taken to the hospital for evaluation after fainting. Her father had been busy with phone calls, meetings, and trying to figure out what to do next. He was doing everything he could to keep the family intact. But Lucy couldn't help but feel like it was all slipping through their fingers. Her mother, once so strong and in control, was now a shell of the person she had been. Lucy barely recognized her when she visited her in the hospital. Her mother's eyes were red from crying, and she seemed lost, detached from everything around her. She hadn't said much since the courtroom, and Lucy didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. How could she? How could she even begin to understand what had happened, let alone forgive her? Lucy spent her time in the quiet of her room, the stillness of the house suffocating her. She couldn't escape the constant question in her mind. Was exposing the truth worth it? Had she really done the right thing? Then, one afternoon, her father called her into the living room. His expression was grim, and Lucy could tell that something had changed. "We need to talk," he said quietly, motioning for her to sit beside him. Lucy sat down, her heart pounding. Whatever was coming next, she wasn't ready for it. "Lucy, I need you to understand something," her father began, his voice steady but filled with concern. "There are things about your mother's involvement in this situation that we still don't know, and we may never know the full truth. But what I can tell you is this. What happened today isn't just a family issue anymore. We're dealing with something much bigger." Lucy's breath caught in her chest. She had suspected as much, but hearing her father say it aloud made everything feel real. This wasn't just about her mother's secret. This was about something much darker. Whatever comes next, her father continued, we face it together, and we'll get through it. But we need to be prepared for the worst. Lucy nodded, her mind spinning. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew one thing for certain. The consequences of the truth were far greater than she had ever imagined. The following days felt like a blur to Lucy. The silence in the house was overwhelming, suffocating almost. It was as if the truth had cast a shadow over everything, and no one knew how to escape it. Lucy spent most of her time in her room, lost in thought, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. Her mother had been taken to the hospital, and her father was dealing with the aftermath, meeting with lawyers, and working with the authorities to figure out what came next. But as much as Lucy wanted to be there for him, she felt like a stranger in her own home. Everything had changed. Then, one morning, just as the sun began to rise and the house was still quiet, Lucy received a phone call. It wasn't from her mother or her father, but from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm but firm, almost official. "Is this Lucy Carter?" the voice asked. Lucy hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, who is this?" "This is Detective Harris," the voice continued. "We need to speak with you regarding your mother's involvement in a criminal investigation. We're working on some key details, and your testimony is now crucial to the case." Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She had expected the police to get involved sooner or later, but hearing it like this, so directly, sent a chill down her spine. The weight of the situation was becoming all too real. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. I didn't think the police would need to talk to me again," Lucy replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We understand this is difficult," Detective Harris said, his voice softening slightly. "But the information you've provided in court has opened up several avenues of investigation. There are aspects of your mother's involvement that we need to understand more clearly. We need to verify some things, and it's important you come down to the station." Lucy felt a rush of confusion and fear. She had already told the truth in court. What else did they want from her? But there was no denying the seriousness of the situation. She couldn't back out now. Her father had already told her that they were all in this together, and now it was time to face whatever was coming. "I'll be there," she said, hanging up the phone before she could hear anything else. She sat still for a moment, the silence in her room feeling suffocating. The weight of the phone call settled over her like a blanket of dread. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. The police had already started to dig deeper into the family's affairs. But what they would find, what secrets they would uncover, was still unknown. All Lucy knew was that her mother's involvement was far deeper than she had ever imagined. And now, it seemed like the investigation was going to reveal things that she hadn't even begun to consider. Lucy found her father in the kitchen a few minutes later, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had been up all night, poring over documents and speaking with lawyers. He didn't look up when Lucy walked in, lost in his own thoughts. "Dad," Lucy said, her voice hesitant, "the police called. They want me to go down to the station." Her father finally looked up, his expression shifting to one of concern. "What for?" "They said it's about Mom," Lucy replied. "They need to verify some things I said in court. They said my testimony has opened up new avenues of investigation." Her father's face tightened, and he stood up from the table, rubbing his temples as if trying to relieve the pressure. "This is getting worse, isn't it?" he murmured, more to himself than to Lucy. Lucy could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. "What do you think they're going to find?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," he replied, his voice shaking slightly. but we have to be ready for whatever comes next. I never thought it would get this far." The reality of their situation was beginning to set in. This wasn't just a family issue anymore. It was something much bigger, something that involved criminal activity. And Lucy wasn't sure if they could outrun the consequences. The drive to the police station felt long and quiet. Lucy's father was unusually quiet, his eyes focused on the road, and Lucy couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. What had he known all along? Had he suspected that their family's life wasn't as perfect as it seemed? As they arrived at the station, Lucy's nerves were on edge. The building loomed in front of them, cold and impersonal, a reminder that their lives were no longer under their control. Her father squeezed her hand gently before they both got out of the car. "Don't worry," he said softly. "We'll get through this. We face it together." Lucy nodded, but her heart was pounding in her chest. She had done what she thought was right, but now, as they walked into the station, the consequences of her actions were becoming clearer by the minute. Inside the station, Detective Harris was waiting for them. His expression was serious, and there was no hint of the calm demeanor he had shown over the phone. He led them into a small interview room where a plain metal table sat between them. The walls were bare, and the fluorescent lights buzzed softly above. It felt sterile, like everything here was meant to feel distant and impersonal. This wasn't the kind of place Lucy had imagined herself in. Not ever. "Sit down," Detective Harris said, motioning to the chairs at the table. He sat across from them, opening a folder and placing several papers on the table. Lucy sat down, her hands trembling in her lap. Her father sat beside her, his face tense. They were both waiting for something, for the next part of the story to unfold. "The information you provided has led us to uncover more details about your mother's involvement," Detective Harris began, his voice steady. "We've gathered evidence that suggests she was involved in money laundering and some other illicit activities." Lucy's breath caught in her throat. Money laundering? Her mother? It was too much for her to process. "We need to ask you about some specific events," Harris continued, his eyes meeting Lucy's. "You were in the courtroom, and you've heard things, but we need to know more." Lucy could feel her heart beating faster. She had no idea what to expect next, but she knew one thing for sure. Her family was in deeper than she had ever imagined. Lucy sat in the small, sterile room at the police station, her mind racing with everything that had unfolded in the last few days. Detective Harris was sitting across from her, his expression unreadable as he flipped through the papers in front of him. Her father, seated beside her, had been unusually quiet since they entered the room. He was still processing the gravity of the situation, just as Lucy was. Everything was happening too quickly, and yet it felt like they were stuck in a moment that would never end. "Lucy," Detective Harris said, his voice cutting through the tension, "I need you to think carefully. There are details we need to confirm. Your mother has been involved in some very serious activities, and it's crucial that we get this right." Lucy nodded, her throat dry. Her fingers clenched tightly in her lap, and she tried to steady her breathing. Her father's hand rested gently on her shoulder, but his grip was weak, his uncertainty hanging in the air. "What activities?" Lucy finally asked, her voice shaky but determined. "What's really going on? What is Mom involved in?" Detective Harris hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We have reason to believe your mother was involved in money laundering, possibly linked to an international syndicate. There are connections we've traced to businesses she's been associated with, but the depth of her involvement isn't entirely clear yet." Lucy's head spun. Money laundering? Her mother? It was impossible to reconcile the woman she knew, the one who had raised her, cared for her, and made sure everything was perfect, with this new image of her mother as a criminal. How could it be true? Her mind raced through memories of the woman she'd always known, the careful planning, the tight control over their finances, the gentle reminders to be honest and do what was right. How could that person be hiding this life? But why? Why would she do this? Lucy's voice was barely a whisper, as though asking the question made it even more real. Detective Harris paused, looking down at the papers in front of him. We don't know yet, but we're working on finding the connections. This goes deeper than just your mother. We believe she might have been working with other people, people who have ties to criminal organizations. There's a lot more to this than we originally thought. Lucy glanced at her father, whose face had gone pale. His jaw was clenched tightly, his hands folded in front of him, and he stared at the table, as if he was avoiding eye contact with both her and the detective. It was clear he was struggling to process the magnitude of the situation. "Dad?" Lucy's voice trembled, her eyes locking onto his. "What's going on? Did you know about any of this?" Her father looked at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. But he didn't answer. He just looked down at his hands. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. Lucy felt a wave of frustration and confusion wash over her. She couldn't bear it anymore. "Dad, please, tell me the truth. What's really going on with Mom? Did you know?" Her father swallowed hard, and when he finally spoke, his voice was tight. I didn't know, Lucy. I suspected something, but I didn't want to believe it. Your mother—" He trailed off, his voice faltering as if the words themselves were too heavy to bear. "I didn't know how deep it went. I should have known, but I didn't. I didn't want to believe it." Lucy's heart sank. She had always believed her father was the one who held everything together, the one who had the answers, who would protect them no matter what. But now, it felt like everything she had ever known was falling apart. If he hadn't known, then who could she trust? "Do you know who she's been working with?" Lucy pressed. "Who else is involved? What did she get herself mixed up in?" Her father shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know, Lucy, but I promise you, we're going to find out. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, to protect you and your mom." Detective Harris cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "We have some leads, but we need to understand more. We've traced some of the transactions back to your mother's business, and we have reason to believe she might have been acting as a conduit for money laundering operations. We believe these operations were hidden under legitimate fronts, businesses your mother was involved in." Lucy's mind raced. She thought back to all the times her mother had come home from work, tired, but always insisting that everything was fine. The constant reassurance that everything was under control. But now, it seemed like it had all been a lie. Her father finally spoke again, his voice heavy with defeat. "I should have asked more questions. I should have seen the signs, but I didn't. I didn't want to face the truth. And now, it's too late." Lucy looked at him, her heart breaking. She had always looked up to him, relied on him for stability. But now, even he seemed broken. The person she had trusted the most, the person she had believed would protect her from everything, was just as lost as she was. "It's not your fault, Dad," Lucy said, though she didn't even know if she believed it herself. "We didn't know. None of us did." "Lucy, there's more to this than we realized," her father said, his voice strained. "It's not just about your mom. It's about everything she's been hiding. There's a web of people connected to her, and we don't know how far it goes." Her heart pounded as she realized the truth. This wasn't just a family issue anymore. It wasn't just about her mother's lies. It was about something much larger, something dangerous, and they were all caught in the middle of it. Lucy's thoughts were interrupted as Detective Harris pulled out a set of photographs from the file. He placed them in front of her, his expression serious. "These were taken during the investigation," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "We believe your mother has been involved with some dangerous people. These photos were taken outside a building where she was meeting with a group of individuals, people we're tracking in connection to the syndicate." Lucy's heart skipped a beat as she looked at the first photo. It showed her mother standing with a man, his face hidden in shadow. He looked familiar, but Lucy couldn't place him. Her mother's expression was tense, as though she was trying to hide something. "This is... Mom?" Lucy asked, her voice barely a whisper. Detective Harris nodded. "Yes, but there's more." He flipped to the next photo, and Lucy's stomach turned. It was another image of her mother, this time standing in a dimly lit alley with two men, their faces obscured by masks. She was handing something to one of them, and Lucy couldn't make out what it was, but the look on her mother's face was unmistakable. Fear, desperation. "This," the detective said, "is just the beginning. We're still piecing it together. But we believe your mother's involvement goes much deeper than we originally thought. We need your help, Lucy. We need you to remember everything you've overheard, everything you know. This isn't just about your family anymore. It's about stopping a criminal operation that's been operating under our noses for years." Lucy's head spun as the weight of the truth hit her all at once. Her mother wasn't just caught up in something bad. She was a part of something much bigger, a criminal network that had been hiding in plain sight. And now, Lucy was caught in the middle of it. She didn't know how to process any of it. The life she had known, the family she thought she understood, had been a lie. And now, as the truth unfolded, Lucy realized she had no idea where it would lead. The days following the police interview were a blur of questions and uncertainty. Lucy couldn't shake the image of the photos that Detective Harris had shown her. Her mother, meeting with masked figures in the dark, exchanging things that Lucy couldn't quite understand. The gravity of the situation was overwhelming, and no matter how hard she tried to focus on something else, the images haunted her. Everywhere she looked, she saw signs of the family she thought she knew, flashes of the woman who had been her protector, her confidant. But now, all of it felt like a lie. Lucy didn't know who to trust anymore. Her father was struggling just as much, trying to hold everything together while keeping his own worries at bay. The man who had always been her rock seemed lost in this whirlwind of secrets and betrayals, just like Lucy herself. But despite all the confusion and fear, there was one thing Lucy was certain of. She couldn't let this happen to her family. She had already exposed the truth, and now it was time to face it head-on. Whatever the cost, she had to know the full extent of what had been going on, even if it meant confronting her mother. It was late one evening when Lucy finally made up her mind. She had overheard snippets of conversations between her father and the police, but none of it made sense to her. What had her mother gotten herself mixed up in? What had driven her to betray the very people she had always claimed to protect? Was it about money? Power? Or was there something deeper? Something darker lurking behind the veil? Lucy decided she needed answers. Her father was in the living room, his voice hushed as he spoke on the phone with someone. She could tell it was another lawyer, or perhaps one of the investigators. She didn't know. But in that moment, she couldn't wait any longer. She had to talk to her mother. She had visited her mother in the hospital earlier that day, but her mother was still out of sorts, lost in a haze of confusion and guilt. Lucy couldn't even bring herself to ask the hard questions. Her mother's broken gaze had been enough to silence any confrontation. But now, sitting alone in her room, Lucy knew she had to face her, even if it was hard. She grabbed her jacket and quietly walked out the door, trying not to disturb her father. The night air was cold, and Lucy hugged her coat tightly around herself as she walked to the hospital. The city was quiet at this hour, the only sounds being the distant hum of cars and the occasional gust of wind. When she arrived at the hospital, Lucy took a deep breath and walked into the building. The sterile smell of disinfectant and the dim lighting made the atmosphere feel even more foreboding. She went up to her mother's room, her heart pounding as she approached the door. She hesitated for a moment before she knocked gently. "Mom?" she called out softly. Her mother's voice from inside was faint. "Lucy? Is that you?" Lucy opened the door, her stomach twisting with nerves. Her mother sat on the bed, looking pale and fragile, her eyes bloodshot from crying. She hadn't seen her mother like this before. So broken, so lost. The strong woman who had always kept it all together was now a shadow of herself. I wanted to talk to you," Lucy said, stepping into the room. Her voice wavered as she tried to keep herself composed. "I need to understand, Mom. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell anyone about all this?" Her mother didn't look up at her immediately. She sat there for a long moment, as if the weight of Lucy's words was too much for her to bear. Finally, she sighed and looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I didn't want you to know," her mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want you to carry the burden I've been carrying. I didn't want you to see me like this." Lucy shook her head, her frustration building. "But why, Mom? Why would you get involved in something like this? You've always told me to do the right thing, to be honest. How could you have hidden something so big from me?" Her mother's gaze dropped to her lap, and for a moment she didn't speak. The silence stretched on until Lucy's patience wore thin. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," her mother said finally, her voice breaking. "It started small, and then it spiraled. I didn't know how to get out of it, Lucy. I thought if I kept going, it would be over soon. I was just trying to protect our family. I thought if I could make enough money, enough to give us a better life, it would all be worth it. But it wasn't. I made terrible choices, and now I've hurt you. Hurt all of us." Lucy's heart ached as she listened to her mother's confession. She had never imagined this was how it would all unfold. The woman who had always been her role model, her strength, was now broken and vulnerable. "I don't know what to do now," her mother continued, tears streaming down her face. "The police are involved. My business is a mess. I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know if I can fix it." Lucy stood in silence, her mind spinning. She wanted to reach out to her mother, to offer comfort, but the betrayal was too much. The woman she had trusted the most was now someone she didn't fully understand. How could she just forgive this? Her voice was soft, but firm. "You have to make this right, Mom. You have to face the consequences of your actions. You can't hide from this anymore." Her mother looked up at her, her eyes filled with guilt and despair. "I don't know if I can, Lucy. I've lost everything." The tears in Lucy's eyes threatened to fall, but she didn't let them. "You can't just give up," she said quietly. "I know you're scared, but we have to face this together. We can't go back, but we can still try to move forward. We can try to fix this." Her mother nodded slowly, wiping away her tears. "I'm sorry, Lucy. I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with regret. The truth had torn their family apart, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to rebuild. Lucy stood there for a moment longer, staring at her mother. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing. She couldn't turn her back on her family. No matter how broken they were, they had to stick together. The air in the hospital room felt thick with unresolved tension as Lucy sat beside her mother, her mind struggling to process everything that had been revealed. She had never imagined that their world would shatter like this. Her mother, once the woman who had kept everything together, was now admitting to a life of lies, of choices that had endangered their family. But as Lucy looked at her, still broken and regretful, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Her mother was still here. And despite everything, Lucy wasn't ready to give up on her. Her father had spent the day in and out of meetings, trying to figure out how to manage the legal fallout. They hadn't spoken much about what was happening, but Lucy could see the weight on his shoulders. His anger had faded, replaced by a quiet determination to protect what was left of their family. But even his resolve couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. Fear for the future. Fear of the unknown. After leaving her mother's room, Lucy's thoughts were still consumed with everything she had learned. The truth had come out, but it wasn't the neat, simple solution she had hoped for. Instead, it was messy, tangled up in criminal enterprises, betrayal, and years of deception. And now that it was all laid bare, there were consequences that no one was prepared for. As she walked back to her father's car that evening, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that they were just getting started. Everything felt like it was moving too fast, too out of control. But one thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't sit back anymore. The truth was out, but the work of rebuilding their lives had only just begun. The next few days were filled with tense meetings and long, quiet conversations. Lucy spent a lot of time at home, trying to process everything, trying to decide what role she had to play in this new version of her family. Her mother remained in the hospital for observation, and while her father did his best to keep the situation from spiraling completely out of control, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. One evening, as Lucy sat in the living room, her father finally sat down across from her, his expression serious. His posture was stiff, but his eyes were filled with an emotion she hadn't seen in a long time. Exhaustion, yes, but also a quiet resolve. "Lucy, we need to talk," he said, his voice low but steady. Lucy looked up at him, her stomach twisting. She had a feeling she knew where this conversation was going. "About what?" she asked, trying to sound calm. "About your mother," he said, pausing as if gathering the right words. "I know this has been hard, for both of you, but I need you to understand something. Your mother is facing serious consequences for what she's done. There's no way around it. The police have already started gathering evidence, and it's only a matter of time before it all comes out. She'll be charged with her involvement in the criminal activities." Lucy's heart sank, but she already knew this was coming. It was what she had feared all along. Her mother would face punishment, and their family would have to pay the price for the lies and secrets that had been kept for so long. "But," her father continued, his voice breaking slightly, "I still believe in your mother. She made a terrible mistake, but I don't think she's beyond redemption. I'm going to fight for her. I'm going to make sure she gets the help she needs." Lucy swallowed hard. Her father's words were meant to comfort her, but they only made the situation feel more complicated. She didn't know if she could forgive her mother, let alone help her face the consequences. How could she reconcile the woman who had raised her with the woman involved in something so dark. "I don't know, Dad," Lucy whispered. "I don't know if I can just forgive her. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. I exposed everything. And now, everything is falling apart." Her father looked at her, his eyes softening with understanding. "Lucy, you did what you thought was right. But there's no going back now. We can't undo what's been done. All we can do is move forward. And we have to do it together." His words hung in the air between them. Lucy wasn't sure what moving forward looked like anymore. The past few weeks had shattered everything she thought she knew. Her family was broken, and even if they could rebuild, would they ever be the same? The days following that conversation were filled with uncertainty. Her mother had been released from the hospital, but she wasn't the same. The woman Lucy had once known was now a shell of herself, filled with regret and guilt. She spent her days in silence, staring out the window, lost in her thoughts. Lucy wanted to reach out, to comfort her mother, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. The anger, the confusion, it was all too much. How could she just forgive her? How could she trust her again? Despite her own turmoil, Lucy tried to stay close to her father. She knew he was struggling too, but he had made it clear that he wasn't going to let their family fall apart without a fight. He had contacted a lawyer, arranged meetings with the police, and even started to investigate the businesses her mother had been involved with. But with every new detail, the picture became clearer. Her mother's involvement wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was part of a larger, more dangerous operation. Lucy's mind raced as she thought about all the questions still left unanswered. What had really happened? How far did her mother's involvement go? Was there anyone else in the family connected to this network? The more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. The truth had brought them no peace. It had only raised more questions. One evening, as Lucy sat at the kitchen table, lost in thought, her father walked in. His expression was grave. "We've found something," he said quietly, setting a folder down in front of her. Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. It was a list of transactions, records from her mother's business that pointed to something much darker than she had imagined. And at the top of the list was a name she recognized. It was her uncle, James. "James?" Lucy whispered, her mind reeling. "What does he have to do with this?" Her father's face was pale, and his jaw tightened as he looked at the papers in front of him. "We need to talk about your uncle. There's more going on here than we realized." Lucy's head was spinning as she stared at the papers her father had placed in front of her. The name at the top of the list, James, seemed to burn into her eyes. Her uncle. The man who had always been a distant but familiar presence in their family had never been a part of her mother's inner circle. And yet here he was, his name linked to the same dangerous criminal activities her mother had been involved in. Her mind struggled to comprehend the implications of what she was seeing. Was it possible? Her uncle, the man who had always been around for family gatherings, who shared quiet moments with them, could he really be involved in something this dark? This wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about their entire family, and it felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling away with every new revelation. "Dad," Lucy said, her voice barely a whisper, "what does this mean? What does James have to do with all of this?" Her father looked at her, his face pale, and he sighed heavily. "I've been trying to piece everything together, Lucy, and I'm afraid it's worse than we thought. We've been looking at the connections, the businesses your mother was involved in, and we've traced a few things back to James. He's been working with your mother all along." Lucy's heart sank. The words seemed impossible, but her father's expression told her everything she needed to know. Her uncle, the man who had been a part of their family for years, was somehow involved in the very criminal network that had nearly destroyed them. The weight of that knowledge hit Lucy like a physical blow. But why? Why would he do this? She asked, her voice trembling. Why keep it from us? Why didn't anyone tell me? How could they hide this from me? Her father closed his eyes for a moment, rubbing his temples as if trying to make sense of everything. I don't know, but I'm starting to understand that James has been working in the shadows, pulling strings, using the family as cover. Your mother wasn't just a pawn in this, she was a key player. And it seems like James has been orchestrating things from behind the scenes. Lucy's mind raced. She remembered all the times her uncle had shown up at family events, his quiet demeanor, his secretive nature. He had always been the mysterious figure at the edges of their family gatherings, but she had never imagined he was hiding something this sinister. How could they have missed it? How could they have trusted him? But why didn't Mom tell us about him? Lucy asked, her voice tight. Why didn't she say anything about James? Did she know everything he was doing? Her father's expression darkened. I think she knew more than she let on. I think she got involved because she felt trapped. And once you're in too deep, it's hard to get out. But James? He's been manipulating the whole family, Lucy. He's been using your mother's business as a front for his operations, and it looks like he's been doing it for years. Lucy's stomach turned. Her whole life had been built on the belief that her family was strong, that they were the kind of people who always did the right thing. But now, everything she knew felt like a lie. She had always believed that her mother was a woman of integrity, someone who would never do anything to hurt them. But now, as the truth came crashing down around her, she didn't know what to think anymore. I don't understand, Dad, Lucy said, her voice shaky. How could he have been doing this all along? How could Mom have been a part of it? Her father shook his head, his gaze distant. I don't know, Lucy. But what I do know is that James has been at the center of this for years. He's been playing us all, and now everything is starting to come to light. A chill ran through Lucy's body as she processed the enormity of what her father was saying. Her Uncle James wasn't just a distant figure in their family. He was the one pulling the strings, the one who had been orchestrating everything from the shadows. Her mother had been just one piece in a much larger operation, and Lucy couldn't shake the thought that everything they had known had been part of his game. We need to find him, Lucy said, her voice firm. We need to confront him. I can't just sit here and do nothing while our family falls apart. Her father looked at her, his face filled with both worry and pride. Lucy, I don't think you understand how dangerous this is. James isn't just a criminal. He's tied to dangerous people. People who would do anything to protect their secrets. This isn't just about us anymore. This is much bigger. I don't care how big it is, Lucy said, her voice steady. I'm not going to let him get away with it. We need to find him and make him pay for what he's done to our family. Her father's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. I know you're angry, Lucy, and I understand. But you have to be careful. James is dangerous, and confronting him is not something we can take lightly. We need to make sure we have a plan, that we know what we're up against. I don't care about the plan, Dad, Lucy said, her voice rising with frustration. I just want to know the truth. I want to know what James has done, what he's been hiding, and I want to make sure he never hurts us again. Her father exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of everything they had learned. I don't know if we can fix this, Lucy, but I'll do everything I can to protect you, and I promise we will face this together. We'll find James, and we'll get to the bottom of all of this." Lucy nodded, though a part of her still felt unsure. The truth was out, but the journey ahead was far from over. They had to find her uncle, confront him, and face whatever came next. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than ever, but Lucy knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let James get away with destroying their family. And so, with a determined resolve, Lucy braced herself for the next steps. The truth had already torn her world apart, but she was ready to do whatever it took to rebuild it, even if that meant facing the most painful truths yet. The days that followed Lucy's discovery about her Uncle James felt like a whirlwind. Everything had shifted so suddenly. Her world was unrecognizable. Her father had been in constant communication with the authorities, trying to track James down. But the deeper they dug into his connections, the more dangerous it seemed. The web of deceit and criminal activity was sprawling, reaching further than anyone had imagined. Lucy couldn't sit idly by. She had already faced the truth about her mother, and now she was determined to face the truth about her uncle. The last week had been filled with anxious phone calls, tense meetings, and whispered conversations between her father and the police. But Lucy wasn't going to let her family fall apart any further. She couldn't let James get away with what he'd done, what he'd forced them all to be a part of. "Dad, we have to do something," Lucy said one evening as she stood beside him in the living room, her eyes burning with determination. "We can't just wait for him to come to us. We have to go after him." Her father, usually the one with the answers, was staring at a stack of papers on the table, his brow furrowed. "Lucy," he said, his voice strained, "I know you're frustrated, but this isn't something we can rush into. We don't know where he is. We don't know who he's working with." "I don't care." Lucy's voice cracked with the weight of her emotions. "I can't sit here and do nothing. Not after everything that's happened. Not after everything I've learned." Her father's gaze softened, but his face remained pale. "I understand," he said quietly. "But we have to be careful. James isn't just a family problem anymore. He's involved in something much bigger than us, and we don't know who we're really dealing with. We need to be smart about this." Lucy clenched her fists, trying to calm the rising anger in her chest. She wanted to scream, to confront James herself, but she knew her father was right. They had to approach this carefully. As much as she hated it, they needed to make sure they had all the pieces of the puzzle before they confronted him. The next morning, Lucy received a call from Detective Harris, and everything seemed to accelerate. "We've located him," Harris said. "We know where he's hiding. We've tracked his movements. We're going to move in." Lucy's heart raced. After days of uncertainty, the moment had finally come. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. This was it. They were finally going to face James. But she couldn't ignore the fear that gripped her chest. The man who had once been a family member, who had been so close to them, was now a criminal mastermind, and he wasn't going down without a fight. "Are you sure?" Lucy asked, trying to steady her voice. "Are we ready for this?" "We're ready," Detective Harris assured her. "We have backup, and we've got a plan. But you need to stay back. I know you're involved in all of this, but this isn't something you need to be a part of. You've already done more than enough." Lucy gritted her teeth, the urge to be there overwhelming. But she understood. This wasn't her battle to fight anymore, not directly. She had done what she could. The next part would be up to the authorities. As the police prepared to move in, Lucy and her father stood together outside their house, waiting for the phone call that would tell them everything was over. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. Lucy felt the weight of everything they had learned, everything they had been through hanging on her shoulders. But in that moment, it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about stopping James from causing more harm to anyone else. Finally, the call came. "James is in custody," Detective Harris said, his voice calm but serious. "It's over. We've got him." Lucy's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in days, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was over. James was no longer a threat to them. They had taken down the man who had manipulated their family, the man who had woven a web of lies and deception so intricate that none of them had even seen it coming. But as Lucy stood there, her father beside her, she realized that while James was behind bars, the damage had already been done. Their family wasn't the same. The truth had torn them apart, and it was impossible to put the pieces back together the way they were. They would move forward, of course. They would try to heal, but it wouldn't be easy. And Lucy wasn't sure if they would ever be whole again. "We did it," Lucy said quietly, looking at her father. Her father nodded, his eyes heavy with regret, but also with something else: relief. "We did. But there's still a lot to figure out. Your mother's involvement. It's not over for her yet." Lucy felt a knot in her stomach. Her mother would still have to face the consequences for what she had done. The police would be involved, and she would have to stand trial for her role in everything that had happened. But Lucy couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Her mother wasn't beyond redemption. They had a chance to rebuild their lives, even if it was difficult. That night, as Lucy lay in bed, she thought about everything she had learned. The lies, the betrayal, the truth that had shattered her family. But she also thought about the strength she had found in herself, the courage it had taken to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. It had been hard, and it had torn her apart, but it had also made her stronger. She didn't know what the future held for her family, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let the past define her. The truth had set her free, and now she would move forward, ready to face whatever came next. No matter how broken her family was, Lucy knew they had a chance to heal. It would take time. It would take effort. But they would try. And that was all that mattered.